Okay. Then also, so you actually noted to us, or you gave us an introspective analogy of what the civil society, maybe the NGO code of ethics and standards is. So tell us, because we understand that it has been a product of several NGO forums or civil society organization forums, how has been the journey?
Yeah, the journey has been quite interesting. I think we are really trying to be very proactive in light of the contextual realities. So for us, it really started with having a deeper understanding of the challenges that we are facing, so that at least we build consensus as a sector to say we need a mechanism that we then use to push back. Because from the background information, like whatever we have discussed so far, you can actually see that the playing field is not even, and the operating environment is actually shrinking. So we can't fold hands and just do nothing about it. We have to come up with a mechanism that we then use to push back. So the first step for us was really to have a deeper understanding of the challenges, because besides the legislative instruments, there are issues around access to funding, there are around security of human rights defenders, there are issues around our ability to engage and influence policies, because that's what we exist to do. So we want to remain afloat to that realization and interpretation of the role that is expected of us. So the first step was really to convene these forums to understand the problems and at least to build consensus to say we are actually facing two different options. One is to go by the route of being over-regulated without our own mechanism, or we need to do something which is coming up with a self-regulatory mechanism in form of a code of ethic and standards. And then after that, we then started to interrogate, because the sector is quite broad and diverse. Because the instrument is supposed to contribute to an enabling environment, not to exclude or to end up closing space for other NGOs. We know we have very small community-based organizations. We also have national CSOs that are relatively large in terms of size, but we also have international NGOs in the same ecosystem. So this kind of an instrument should be a mechanism which really address and incorporate those diversities within the sector. So we then engaged a consultant to provide the technical assistance in terms of coming up with some code of ethics. But again, we looked at quite a number of other international best practices. For humanitarian work, we have the 9 core sphere standards. For local NGOs, or for what we call local actors, in light of the localization agenda, also have the Istanbul principles. So we really looked at all those other good practices and also learning from other jurisdictions, because we have our sister organization in other countries. They have been really working this journey of coming up with the mechanisms, the likes of Uganda. We had an opportunity to invite some colleagues from there to also come in and give their perspective as to how this process should be done and how we can approach this process. And then after we have developed the draft, we go back, just to make sure that still it really speaks to different organizations, so that it doesn't necessarily being something that in terms of operationalization, it becomes difficult, because for certain organizations, they can't really implement it because it's too heavy. And we also understand one of the ideas to make sure that there is accountability mechanisms. And mind you, accountability comes with implications in terms of resources. It's costly. There are cost implications. So I also want to look at that to say, is it something that can be implemented? Is it affordable? Is it feasible? So we have done that process. So now we are at a time where the document is actually being finalized. We have done the validation. We have done further, input. But also to mention that this is going to be a lively document which can be adjusted with time. So every time we meet, we convene meetings, we learn other new aspects which might need to be considered or to be incorporated in the document. So it shall be a lively document which can be updated and reviewed over time.
That's great. So now that you have given us a picture of how the journey was, what the technical process was.
Yes.
We also now want to know, then how then do civil society organizations take part in operationalizing the code of ethics and standards? Because from how I get it, it's more of supply, preactively toward demand.
Yeah.
So now we want to know how then can civil society organizations operationalize it?
Yeah, so the first aspect is really to bridge the gap, because we need to understand before we go to, because obviously we will reach a point where we need organizations to subscribe. By subscribing, it's going to be voluntary, by the way, because remember, we are not trying to police, which is the same problem that we are having with our regulators. So this is going to be voluntary, and it has to be benefit driven. So for us to derive that value, especially to the CSOs, they need to understand how to apply the mechanism, because, you know, if you look at the code of ethics, there are certain practices that we are trying to promote. There are certain governance structures that we are trying to push for, to say, for an institution, it should have, like, you must have a board that then play oversight over the function of the secretariat or the staff that are doing the day-to-day running of the organization. So we have been now trying to make sure, as part of operationalization, is the first to try and break it down. It covers aspect of program management, financial management, and also aspect of the governance part of the organization. And in doing so, we are actually now reaching out to many individuals, even from the same organization, because we have been really targeting the directors as decision makers, for them to really see the value of this. But going forward, there are certain changes that might actually be triggered by this instrument in terms of the organizational structure. And you then need more people to really understand what it means, you know, and also to start to sell the idea even to the partners and other stakeholders in the ecosystem, because this structure or mechanism has to be credible. Like I mentioned, it's supposed to serve the purpose of being a defense mechanism for CSOs or for NGOs to be able to push back repressive legislations and operational modalities that are being introduced. So for us to really make sure that this becomes credible, we also need to start involving other actors in the ecosystem, including the government itself. The financial intelligence unit, because they are the ones that then deals with issues of FATF. In the country, we also have a national task force on anti-money laundering and countering of terrorism financing. So we have also started to then reach out to them so that they also give their final inputs to it. And that way it becomes credible, even in terms of us applying it. But over and above, we also tend to come up with then what we call quality assurance mechanism for the instrument or for the code of ethics, to make sure that those that are actually subscribing to the ethic are also seeing some sort of value as to their due diligence, even in terms of fundraising, to say if an organization is really accredited as a subscriber of the code of ethics and standard, the partners, the government could really see that this organization is actually above board in terms of their structures and the systems in place.
That's quite insightful. So the issue is just, it's also, from what I get, is it's a matter also of one, will from the local players.
Yes.
And then secondly, it's a matter now of reciprocal capacity building.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in parting words, Mkoma Ernest, what else can we do in order to safeguard, especially the integrity of local CSOs as institutions in our country?
Yeah, there are quite a lot of things to be done. I'm personally quite worried about the narrative. I think we need to continue to tell our story. I like this platform, because it really showcases the work that we are doing. We are putting the NGOs on spotlight out there. There are a lot of there is a lot of misinformation. People don't really understand what we do, because if we are not telling our own story, somebody else will do. But that story might not necessarily dovetail or reflect what we do as organizations. So one of the areas that we need to work on is making sure that we are visible. We come up with profiles of our combined impact as NGOs, but also we don't operate undercover. It's our role even to defend human rights. Let us do it, as long as we are following the principles, and we are not stepping out from our mandates. I think it's quite good for us to start, thinking about how do we showcase our work, come up with our CSO in social investment platforms that we can then help to justify our relevance and also to prove our legitimacy and accountability.
Thank you very much. So this was Mr. Ernest Nyimai, the Executive Director of the National Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, giving us a clear-cut picture of what the CSO Code of Standards, Ethics and Standards is all about, and how it also aids the implementation of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, especially looking at recommendation number 8, that is much to do with organizations in the NPO sector. So I am Liam Kanenga, and this was Into Zimbabwe, a weekly production brought to you by Protect Defenders ZW and the National Association of Youth Organizations. See you next time.